This is the second half. This is Stephen Ambrose, D-Day, the 6th of June, 1944. Tonight's program is going to pick up the invasion itself where last month's prelude program ended. I hope you two got to see last month's program.
I didn't. Where were you at that point?
Okay, the prelude described the preparations for D-Day. And by the way, the prelude is on the YouTube site, John, the Signal Mountain Military History YouTube.
Okay.
But it described how they chose the site they went to, the dates they chose, all of the planning and training. It even included the embarkation of the fleet. And when you think about the size of the fleet, it didn't all just push off on a moment's notice.
Yeah.
It talked about how the decision to begin the invasion was not agreed upon. Most of Eisenhower's staff was not in favor of going the day that they went. His naval officer and his air officer both were against it. But Montgomery did agree. There was a very small window in weather, and Eisenhower said, let's do it. This program is going to describe the assault itself. I'm going to start with the C-47s departing with the paratroopers on the 5th of June. And it concludes where Ambrose stopped this book, which is the end of the day on the 6th of June. As the book written by Cornelius Ryan, I don't know if you all have seen that book, The Longest Day. It was a long, long day for the Allies, but also for the Germans. Now, there were some decisions that preceded D-Day that were pretty important. There was a strategic bombing campaign. This was Eisenhower's intent was to bomb the French transportation infrastructure for several months before D-Day. However, Churchill and the American Air Force both wanted to continue strategic bombing of the German war production. Since Eisenhower was the supreme commander, he got his way. That's where the bombing campaign was focused, in France. German defenses were concentrated around the ports along the west wall. The biggest concentration was around Calais, which is well north of where the actual landings occurred. The Allied plan was to annihilate, now this is the plan specifically for the invasion, was to annihilate the fixed positions with air attacks. They didn't accomplish that. The air attacks that were made for the couple of days preceding the landing were pretty ineffective, especially at Omaha. The Omaha air attacks accomplished almost nothing. Despite warnings from von Rundstedt, and von Rundstedt was the German in charge of the entire west wall, the German forces, and this is Rommel, he was in charge of the army that they attacked, counted on stopping the Allies at the beaches. They really had no counterattack capability. And that, in Ambrose's view, was a tremendous strategic mistake. Luftwaffe resources had been squandered. For the 6 months prior to D-Day, the Germans were busy bombing England with the Luftwaffe and had most of their aircraft destroyed in that bombing attack. Consequently, they did not have much of an air force available for the invasion. Finally, and this is not insignificant either, the German forces along the coast were dependent on men from Eastern countries. They even used Russian prisoners. They used people from Finland, Romania, Norway. And a number of these people didn't want to be there, didn't want to be serving under the Germans. The German NCOs and officers of these men were unable to get them to function the way they wanted to function. So those are decisions that actually preceded D-Day. Now I'm going to give you a quick overview of the invasion. There were originally just 3 beaches, Omaha, Gold, and Juneau. That was going to be Overlord to begin with. In the planning process, they added another beach, Utah Beach here, and Sword Beach here. They did this for 2 particular reasons. One was they wanted to spread the challenge to the Germans, but in addition, this port, Cherbourg, was an early objective. What they wanted to do was get Cherbourg so that they could start bringing ships in from the English Channel. None of these areas were capable of taking any substantial amount of logistic support. The 2 airborne divisions of the Americans were going to be here behind Utah Beach. Their mission was to interdict German reaction coming from this area, and they were also responsible for protecting the right flank of the invasion force. The British Airborne Division, on the other hand, and they landed right in here. Okay, this is where the British Airborne was. Their primary responsibility was protecting the left flank of the invasion. I'm going to talk quite a bit about the airborne units, what they did and did not accomplish. The Allied Air Force had 10,000 bombers, fighters, and transport planes. Against that, the Luftwaffe could not even field 500 airplanes. As I said earlier, the German fighter and bomber losses in their recent air campaign left them unable to defend from the air.
Do you think the Allied forces knew that? Did they know the numbers like that?
No, not like that. They anticipated that they had air command of the air, but they had no idea how much command they were going to have. The Allies had what they call air supremacy. And air supremacy means you can do just about anything you want in the air. And they needed that air supremacy because they had 27,000 paratroopers loading into C-47s and gliders the afternoon of June the 5th. 13,000 American paratroopers from the 82nd and the 101st made night parachute drops. That was the beginning of D-Day. The next day they brought in 4,000, this is the Americans now, glider troops into the area. So those 2 divisions were supposed to be where I shot you. Excuse me.
How many of those numbers really, those people got on the ground? They didn't, they didn't die in the process.
Most of them got to the ground. Now, what they accomplished was 2 different things.
Yeah.
There were a number of planes shot down full of paratroopers, but by and large, they got to the ground. They did not get to the ground with all of their equipment. And what was worse, they didn't get to the ground where they were supposed to be.
Yeah.
As I said, their missions were to block approaches in the vicinity of the amphibious landing, to capture all the causeway exits off the beach, and to assist the 5 Corps in merging the 2 beachheads. That's Omaha and Utah. The assault did not succeed on the American side at all. Did not block the approaches to Utah for one reason, the scattering of the drops. Now, why did this happen? Why did they go wrong?
Well, isn't this another example, George? Maybe you're going to touch on this, but the navigation skills, it seemed, were really bad. I mean, the bombing was bad. They bombed the wrong stuff. They weren't close enough to the
Well,
target.
I'll get to the bombing.
Okay.
I'll talk about that, I hope.
Yeah, that was before the idea was bomb the heck out of them.
Right.
And then have the paratroopers come in, and
Right.
I wouldn't say a cakewalk, but it'd be a lot easier, huh?
The way the system was supposed to work was a number of early Pathfinder groups were going to land in these designated drop zone areas, and they were going to set up beacons to bring the rest of the forces in. That was the plan. 300 men of the Pathfinder group, and they were organized into 25 teams, were to deploy these beacons, which would guide the main force. That was the concept.
Are we talking visual or radar type?
Visual. These ground beacons were visual.
All right.
At best, the system was marginal. A number of Pathfinders never got to their assigned areas, and even worse, most of their beacons were damaged in the drops. So first of all, they didn't even get where they were supposed to go. But secondly, when they got there, they couldn't do anything.
Yeah.
Many factors disrupted the accuracy of the drops. Anti-aircraft fire was far more intense than they expected. And what that did was broke up the flights of the C-47s. They were coming in flights of 9 with one person who actually had a navigator and knew where they were going. These flights were supposed to follow their flight leader. 2/3 of the planes had no navigators. And as flights dispersed, the pilots simply didn't know where to go.
Okay.
Many of the drop zones were not adequately marked, or they were obscured with smoke and fog. And one of the things that they learned was dropping 13,000 men in the middle of the night was not a good idea. Drop runs of the C-47s were either too high, too low, or too fast. So once they broke up, the pilots were just on, let me get over where I think I'm supposed to be and get rid of these people and get the hell out of here. The result looked something like this. Remember those drop zones that you saw? Here are the drop zones. Several of the drop zones had nobody in them. They were all over the place. One drop zone of the 82nd was fairly close to where it was supposed to be. There were paratroopers 20 miles northwest of the drop zone. There were some who had dropped out in the channel. They were just all over the place. The airborne forces just weren't where they were supposed to be, and they were scattered all to hell and gone. They were not effective as combat units, period. Much of their equipment was either lost or damaged in the drops. They're dropping this stuff in the middle of the night. Nobody could find, the paratroopers themselves were losing their equipment. The equipment that they were dropping, the jeeps, the small artillery, they never got their hands on. They were just, this whole crowd of people was basically on their own. There was almost no unit cohesion among the units that were dropped. And what happened was the airborne troops began collecting in what was called roving bands, looking for a fight. They were limited in their effectiveness. Later on, they realized that the night jump was a bad mistake. The assembly made it was very difficult to assemble any kind of a group of men, and it had many unnecessary casualties. None of the 82nd's objectives in clearing areas west of the rivers, and that is in here, or destroying bridges were achieved for the same reasons. Now, the airborne because they were all to hell and gone, did cause some disruption in the Germans. They didn't know what was going on. Clearly, we didn't know what was going on. Wasn't what was supposed to be going on, but we had 13,000 men scattered around this area, and that did cause the Germans trouble. They didn't know where to focus any kind of counterattacks. The airborne forces suffered almost 20% casualties on D-Day and subsequent breakout. What they learned from this, they would not do again in Market Garden later on. Now, the British Airborne, on the other hand, was gliders. The British did not believe in jumping out of airplanes. They assaulted the eastern side of the zone. They had 3 objectives. There were 2 bridges across the Orne and the Caen Canal that they wanted to keep intact. Those bridges were seized, and there's really quite a bit done about something called the Pegasus Bridge across the Orne Canal. We saw that when we went on the Band of Brothers tour, and how they got those gliders down where they wanted was really impressive. Second, their second objective was a battery of 155 millimeter guns, which they knew to be a threat to the Sword Beach landing. That had to be silenced. The British did manage to capture the battery, but suffered heavy losses doing so. 5 bridges east of the Orne were to be destroyed to disrupt German reinforcement and prevent a counterattack. 4 of the 5 bridges were destroyed after the airborne forces landed. Now, they had trouble too. They had lack of visibility. They had lack of experience of some of their pilots. So they had a number of missed drops. British paratroopers were scattered and lost also. However, with gliders, 2 things they could do. One was they could keep their unit cohesion together, and they also were able to salvage more of their equipment. They accomplished most of their objectives. You don't hear much about that. What you hear about is the 82nd and the 101st and how good they were and what they did. You don't hear that the British Airborne unit was a great deal more effective. Air support. Talked about 10,000 Allied fighters and bombers. None were lost to the Luftwaffe. 113 of those were shot down with flak. Wave after wave of medium and light bombers swept down the invasion beaches in advance of the landing. On day 1, D-Day, Allied planes flew 14,000 sorties compared to 250 flown by the Luftwaffe. 1,000 B-17s and B-24s bombed the beaches along Omaha, Gold, Sword, and Juneau. Utah, though, was bombed by B-26s, which is a much lighter, can do its work at a much lower elevation. The B-26s were fairly effective. The B-17s and B-24s were not. The Utah beach, and I'm going to talk about each of the beaches in turn, their landing was little impeded. However, the heavy bombers were ineffective. They were just too high to hit specific targets. However, the Allied heavy bombing interdiction prior to the landing was very effective. It reduced the German capacity to counterattack. The column of ships. The column was led by 255 minesweepers, and they swept 10 lanes for traffic between England and the beaches. The mines were literally the Germans' only naval defense, and a number of ships were sunk by mines, especially as they got closer to the beaches. The landing craft tanks came next. Most of them, these LCTs, carried 6 tanks and jeeps filled with ammunition. The reason that they were second is because they were flat-bottomed and slow. The bombardment group, now this is the long-range artillery, consisted of 6 battleships, and these were all either World War I era battleships or not too far thereafter, but they had 14 and 16-inch guns, 20 cruisers and 68 destroyers. The 2,900 transports, including LSTs, landing craft infantry, landing craft M, and I forget what the other 2 are, they followed. Fleet was spotted on German radar at 0309. They sent some E-boats out to investigate, but the E-boats did not engage the fleet. Either they thought that it was too large or they were just afraid.
What's an E-boat? I thought they're U-boats. What are E-boats?
E-boats was the German, and I talked about this on the prelude talk. An E-boat was kind of an equivalent of a PT boat, except it was bigger, faster, and more heavily armed. So it was a fast attack kind of
Surface boat.
surface boat. They raised hell in one of the invasion training units several months before D-Day. They killed 800 Americans. They got in among the Americans who were practicing landing and just raised hell with them. But they did not on D-Day. At 0500, both sides opened fire. With the exception of the destroyers, naval gunfire was disappointingly ineffective. And then what happened was, as the landing craft neared the shore, the naval support fire had to be elevated. Now, one beach at a time, Utah Beach. It was assault. Yeah.
How come the naval gunfire wasn't accurate? I mean, you know, certainly at some point in World War II, they came in with those Mark 8s or whatever they were. You know, they had that all that gun management stuff. And it was really pretty good. I remember people saying, hell, they could put a shell in the same hole twice, you know?
There were several reasons for it. One of them was the German wall, their defensive positions were either very, very heavily reinforced concrete, below ground trenches. They were the kinds of defenses that even unless you were very close and very accurate, you weren't going to do anything about. 16-inch shell was not going to penetrate one of these defense positions.
Yeah.
And once they started, they couldn't see what they were doing. They were 3, 4, 5 miles offshore. They were firing blind. They had a system where they were going to send in forward observers, get them on the ground, get those forward observers talking to the big guns. The problem was the forward observers and the big guns were not communicating. That was another problem. It didn't work.
Yeah.
Utah was assaulted by the 4th Infantry Division. Their intention was to seal off the peninsula and then capture the port of Cherbourg. Remember I talked about Cherbourg?
Yeah.
They encountered 2 battalions of the 919th Grenadier Regiment, part of what was called a static infantry division. That static infantry division included a number of various nationalities, mostly from the occupied countries of Eastern Europe, and they were not interested in fighting. They surrendered almost as soon as they could. A high percentage of this division had no combat experience. They landed 21,000 troops on Utah at the cost of 197 casualties in the infantry. And for all intents and purposes, those were people who were killed as they were coming across the obstacles, not by infantry fire. Airborne troops who were arriving by parachute and glider, another 14,000 men, had 2,500 casualties.
Isn't casualties a number that includes death and just injuries, severe injuries, or what is that?
Yeah, it's both.
2,500 is killed, wounded, and lost.
All right.
About 700 men were lost in the engineering units, the 70th Tank Battalion, and seaborne vessels sunk by the enemy. Remember, I said a number of ships were sunk. Now, I'm going to tell you, I'm going to go on a little diversion. You ever heard of a swimming tank?
I've read about this.
The 70th Tank Battalion was an integral part of the landing.
Is that an Amtrak?
No, it was light tanks, primarily M4 Sherman tanks. They were duplex driven. In other words, they could drive on land with their tracks, or they had a propeller that drove them. They had a canvas water skirt that allowed them to float. Many of the tankers were skeptical and spent their own money to reinforce the fabric in their water skirts. Most of the tanks launched on Utah made it to shore, 24 out of 28, primarily because Utah, far enough away from Omaha, had calm seas. On Omaha Beach, large waves swamped many of the duplex-driven tanks. The tanks were a significant factor in the relative ease of assaulting Utah Beach. So they got their light tanks ashore and functioning very effectively. But when I talk about Omaha, it's a different story. Now, another little tidbit. The 237th Engineer Battalion were a direct support of the 4th Division, in addition to the Division Engineer Battalion. Their mission was to clear obstacles on the beach. They used bulldozers and Bangalore torpedoes. They were to breach the seawall. They were to build ramps up the seawalls. The seawalls on Utah were not very significant. They were pretty easy to get over. Utah was just the opposite. Once the seawall was breached, these engineers followed the dozers inland and they ran into minefields. They were the first troops inland. A number were killed with mines, especially bouncing Bettys. I don't know if either of you know what that is. It's a mine that when you step on it, as you release your foot, the mine bounces up in the air and then it explodes. We had bouncing Bettys in our basic load in Germany. Then their mission became mine clearing, and their job was making paths through the mines for the infantry. They reportedly cleared more than 10,000 mines from these minefields. This was the battalion that I joined when I went to Germany in 1963. Now, here's something that I thought you might be interested in. You were talking about why was artillery fire not effective from the naval guns. I'm going to talk to you about something called a Tobruk. I did not know what this was. The Atlantic Wall really wasn't a wall at all. It was a line of defenses built by the Todt. The Todt was a civil and military engineering organization in Germany from 1933 to 1945. That's who built the wall. It was built mostly with slave labor. The founder of Todt, and that was his name, by the way, died in an airplane crash immediately after he told Hitler that the war on the Eastern Front was unwinnable. Some people thought that was a bit suspicious. In addition to pillboxes, and most of the big guns were in pillboxes. When we went to Omaha, Omaha had these heavy duty pillboxes at both ends and in the middle with 88 millimeter guns sighting down the beaches, and there was no way even a 16-inch shell was going to penetrate them. But in addition to these pillboxes and crew-served emplacements, which were the mainstays, there were some unique fortifications. This small, circular, reinforced concrete bunker, known as a Tobruk, was designed for a single soldier. He usually was armed with a machine gun. They were shelters with an opening at the top. The opening gave the soldier some protection and enabled him to sweep the area he was defending with a simple circular movement. In the book, he keeps talking about Tobruks, and he doesn't ever show you one, but I found one online. Some Tobruks were protected on the top, like the one shown here. Some of them were not. So one person in this little gadget here with a machine gun was tough to defend against.
Did this thing rotate? Was it fixed?
He could rotate. No, it was fixed, but he could move his gun. He had a pretty good range of fire. Okay. And looking down the beach, depending on how far away he was, these things overlapped with each other. There were a lot of these Tobruks on each beach. Omaha Beach was just the opposite. It was the best defended. It had a much higher seawall with limited access lanes from the beach. And the sea was rougher. And you wouldn't think that there would be any difference in the sea in just 30 miles, but there was. Omaha Beach is 3 miles long. It's 7 miles east of Utah. It has 3 small towns within a mile of the beach. It was assaulted by 5th Corps, the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions. The bombing of this beach had been ineffective because the bombers were too high because of thick fog and cloud cover. They basically rattled some cages, but they did not seriously affect the German defenses on Omaha. The heavy naval artillery was also ineffective. It was just too imprecise against dug-in defensive positions. At 0635, the initial assault coming ashore here had to cover 500 yards of exposed beach. And their tank support never made it. The tanks at Omaha, beginning at 3 o'clock, 64 Sherman tanks of the 741st Tank Battalion were to be launched and reach the coast. The sea off Omaha was too active. The tanks had to be launched too far from shore. Only 11 of the tanks actually managed to reach the shore. The rest of them sank, and their crews sank with them. As a result, the other tank battalion on Omaha told their LCTs, bring the tanks all the way onto the beach. The LCT people were not happy doing that, but they did it fairly well. The 743rd reached the beach. The problem was once they were on the beach, they couldn't get up the wall in front of them, and they were sitting ducks for the German artillery. So the tanks at Omaha were not an effective part of the Omaha landing. Meanwhile, the landing efforts, and you saw the movie Saving Private Ryan, that's what it was like on Omaha. Landing craft were being hit, men were jumping into deep water with heavy equipment. It was Saving Private Ryan on a grand scale. Not only that, those who got ashore then huddled at the seawall. And one of the Germans said, if they had a broom, they could have swept us back into the sea. Engineers, though, using their Bangalores, and I made the point earlier in the first program, how important the engineers were to these landings. They were blowing lanes in the barbed wire. They were using mine detectors. They were designating paths among the mines. There was very little communication with the men ashore. Even though you saw all of the detailed markings about where all of the units were to go, that is not what happened. They were intermixed with each other. There was just chaos on Omaha Beach. The shore was clogged with wounded and dying men, with damaged equipment, and all of the detritus of a massive firefight. By 8 o'clock, the first groups were starting to make their way up the slope of the dunes. And from then on, individually, they fought their way inland. I want to tell you about Omar Bradley. He was the first Army commander. He was from Randolph County, Missouri. He was a member of the class of 1915, the class they said the stars fell on. Over a third of their graduates were general officers. Eisenhower was Bradley's classmate. He was a corps commander in North Africa and in Sicily, and he was promoted to command the First Army. At D-Day, he was out aboard the ship, the USS Augusta, which was a heavy cruiser. Years later, he described Omaha as a nightmare, a time of his personal anxiety and frustration. In the midst of the fog of war, and this is in the morning of D-Day, he considered evacuating the beach at Omaha. And one of the reasons he didn't do it was because it was even worse than trying to put people ashore. He considered evacuating and realizing that if he went in with more boats and tried to pick these people up, the German artillery would just make mincemeat out of them. He also considered sending Omaha's follow-up waves elsewhere, but then he persevered with his original plan. As a three-star general, he had zero control of the fight. Another digression. This is the German infantry division that they were facing at Omaha. It had been formed in November of 43. It was a frontline all-German combat division. It was originally formed to fight on the East Front against the Russians, but they moved it to Omaha Beach. They knew that Omaha Beach was a lucrative landing possibility. Its focus had been improving the beach obstacles, putting in mines, iron cross obstacles, and timber structure obstacles. This is where they were. And remember, I was saying that they could not be hit by naval gunfire. They were in concrete bunkers, pillboxes, mortar pits, rocket launchers, and machine gun nests. The defenses themselves were clustered in strong points. It was by far the most effective unit in defense on D-Day. Allied intelligence did not know it was there. They thought that the entire beach area was actually defended by those static defense divisions that I talked about that were at Utah. Despite being outnumbered 3-1, they inflicted heavy casualties on the landing forces on Omaha before slowly giving ground. And they were pretty badly chewed up themselves after the invasion and the Allied breakout. They were no longer an effective unit. You've heard of Patton Hook? The legends of Patton Hook aren't true. It's a small peninsula between Omaha Beach and Utah Beach. It has cliffs 120 feet high, and they thought that it housed 155 millimeter guns. 2 battalions of Rangers were assigned to neutralize these guns. Only 1 company out of 2 battalions actually landed where it was supposed to. The rest of the Rangers were spread on the right flank of Omaha. C Company, that's the company that did get there, with grappling hooks and ropes, were able to scale the cliffs. But the guns weren't there. They had been moved inland because the casements were not ready for them. Once the Rangers got up on top, they were able to move inland. They found the guns and they disabled them before the garrison itself could protect them. So they accomplished their mission with 1 company. The other 6 were busy fighting that German infantry division I was telling you about. The Rangers then dropped back on Patton Hook into a defensive perimeter and spent the rest of the day there. Destroyers. Operation Neptune was the name of the naval and amphibious action. Although the majority of naval gunfire was ineffective, one group of ships were factors. With the onset of the landing and the smoke and haze obscuring the beaches, the big artillery platforms were just blind. They couldn't see anything. Without clear orders, a number of destroyers approached the beach and started providing point-blank range 5-inch guns against the pillboxes and machine gun nests. Some destroyers got as close as 800 yards of the coastline. They were risking being grounded to support the men on the beach. 3 destroyers moved in close and supported those Rangers that I talked about on Patton Hook. 6 destroyers, I didn't know this, were lost on D-Day. I assume that they hit mines mostly. Maybe a couple of them were hit by 88s from the shore. Now, very briefly, I'm going to talk about the Brits, because Ambrose's book is about the American efforts. He spends 85% of the time talking about the American efforts, very little time talking about the British. He does acknowledge that Gold, Sword, and Juno were integral parts of the invasion. 2 corps, 100,000 men of British and Canadian forces landed on these 3 beaches. Most of their tanks were brought in closer to the shore before they were launching, and they landed intact. The conditions that they faced were different. It was open urban terrain. There were strong defensive positions, especially a bit inland. Here, I'm going to talk a little bit about that. There were a German Panzer Corps across their front. So instead of infantry divisions, the Brits ran into 3 panzer divisions. Each of the 3 beachheads was fully secured on D-Day before noon. They encountered similar German defenses, but they overwhelmed the beach positions there relatively quickly. The beaches were just not defensible where they landed. They were able to make, and they had those 300 tanks. They made the armored forays out from the beaches and quickly encountered German resistance. The only German counterattack occurred on Sword Beach. The 21st Panzer Division stopped the incursion there. This is over here. Total Allied casualties on the 3 beaches were less than that on Omaha alone. The initial landings were more successful, but the German in-depth defense was far more effective against the Brits. Now, I want to talk about one of their objectives. The Brits wanted to capture the town of Caen. It was deemed of critical importance. Montgomery believed that its capture would open the door to Paris. It was a D-Day objective to capture the city that day. The airborne landings were behind it and cut off its reinforcements, but it did not adequately isolate the city. The German forces between the city and the coast were very strong, especially the tank units. There was a Panzer Corps facing the British Second Army, and this really changed their ability to move inland. Caen wasn't taken on day 1. It wasn't even taken on day 35. It fell in late July. They could not get through the German defense in depth around Caen. D+1. Darkness ended D-Day at 10 p.m. Further unloading ceased. 175,000 American, British, and Canadian troops were ashore across a front of 60 miles. There was a gap between Utah and Omaha, and smaller gaps between Omaha and Gold, and Juneau and Sword. There was little depth to the tow holes, especially at Omaha. Unlimited Allied enforcements, though, were waiting for the following day to reinforce the bridgeheads on the 6,000 ships still offshore. The Allies suffered almost 8,000 casualties, primarily on Omaha and with the Airborne. Believe it or not, what I read was they expected it to be worse. Allied air interdiction, and now I'm talking about away from the battlefield, made it impossible for the Germans to reinforce their units at the coast. By D+1, the Allies had cracked the western wall. Now here's Ambrose's conclusions, some of which you might find interesting. Both sides made major mistakes on D-Day. The Allied mistakes were costly. The airborne night drop, the use of heavy bombers, and ineffective naval bombardments are just two of the mistakes that were made by the Allies. The German mistakes were fatal. They had no defense in depth. Once the wall was penetrated, they had no way to stop the Allies except the hedgerows. And the hedgerows, if you wanted to read about them, were an ongoing problem in Normandy. One at a time, and there was every street you came to had a hedgerow. Hitler was asleep. He could not be awakened until noon to release the panzer units. He had said, the panzer units cannot be released for action until I personally say so. And he was asleep. By noon, it was too late. Rommel had put all of his faith in the wall. When it cracked, he had no strategic response. Ambrose compared the Atlantic Wall to the Maginot Line, which was one of the worst blunders in history. And that's the end
Of the first day.